So for those of you who are streaming, we welcome you. We'll get started in just a second, but we are aware that you've been waiting for almost 10 minutes. So if you are streaming, welcome to All Saints Church. We would love to have information from you about your contact information. So if you would file that on our website, we would love to invite you and everybody else who is in this room who does not get an email blast from me every Thursday telling you what's going to happen in this room and why. Please, there are green sheets at clipboards over here that you can fill out, and we'll get the information to you. Also, at All Saints, we think that our worship gets completed in action. And so our action today is a letter to the president asking him to stop this callous deportation of families who are refugees from Central America and who've escaped violence there and are just being sent back. And we stand with refugees here at All Saints Church. Please, please, please sign that letter. And then if you, we would love to have your participation at All Saints, and we're really, really glad you're here. Now, the way we're going to work this is I'm going to introduce our beloved and treasured guests, and Juliana is going to facilitate our conversation. I may kind of step in from time to time. But we are really thrilled to have two of the wisest and smartest people I know. I have known them for more than 10 years. In the case of Dr. Turner, 15 years. And they are wonderful resources to us in our work to dismantle racism. They train people all the time about having multiculturalism skills, and they're here to talk about how Dr. King and Dr. King's values inspired them. So just a word of introduction of both of them. To my immediate right is Ana Perez, an immigrant rights leader and a passionate leadership and community builder. She works with nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and foundations to increase their impact and organizational effectiveness. She has expertise in organizational change, multicultural transformative leadership development, and in building collaborations rooted in equity and community empowerment frameworks. She, prior to becoming a visions consultant, which is where Juliana and I know her, she's held senior positions in civil rights, national and international policy groups, and on and on and on. She and her family fled El Salvador in the Civil War there in the early 1980s. Grew up in the Central American community here in Los Angeles, benefiting from the 1986 immigration reform law. She's highly credentialed and got all sorts of degrees, and I'd rather hear her talk about Dr. King and her life than tell you all these degrees she has. Dr. Jim Turner, if I were developing a tribe of wisdom people, he would be the elder I would ask to come in and be our chief. He's a licensed clinical community psychologist for more than 30 years, expert witness for bonding and attachment studies of foster and adoptive parents and their children. He works in chemical dependency and is an addiction specialist. Professor of psychology, consultant on diversity and multicultural competence challenges in public and private organizations locally and nationally. He's a licensed psychologist with Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in Oakland, on the faculty at Wright Institute in Berkeley, faculty member of JFK University, Orinda, Pleasant Hill, California, and a senior staff consultant for Visions, Inc. from 2000 to the present. Would you please warmly welcome our friends Ana and Jim. Juliana Serrano is my favorite staff colleague right now, in this moment. She came on board as the director of the Office for Creative Connections, and worked with Carissa Baldwin McInnes, and when Carissa left, I asked her to be the director of not only OCC but also P&J, and to come on the executive staff of All Saints Church. She just had her birthday 2 days ago, the day before Dr. King's birthday. She and he have a lot in common at the level of the soul and the spirit, and also the constellations. Will you warmly welcome Juliana Serrano? It's high-quality baloney. Juliana, please.
Well, thank you. Is this hot? There we go. All right. Well, I want to personally welcome Jim and Anna. It's a pleasure to have you here. Although our relationship has not been as long as that of yours with Ed, I look forward to building a relationship of exceeding 10 years as we do this work with peer supervision. It's a really wonderful opportunity through this agency visions to further our capacity to manage multiculturalism skills in this pluralistic world, and I'm lucky that I get to do it with colleagues like Anna and Jim, and to get to know you both personally and get to know the professional work that you're doing. So it's truly an honor. As Ed mentioned, I think we should just start to hear from you, and I hope that this will be conversational, and feel free to take the mic and speak whenever you like. And I even told Jim, I said, I kind of want to get in close and feel like this is a conversation. I would love to. Yes, good. I would love to hear your stories of how you first came to know about Dr. King, and because I was thinking about that, knowing again almost my entire life that Dr. King and I were just a birthday apart. That's always been my context for Dr. King. I was born the 14th, he was born the 15th, and it was later in life that I came to know who the man was, not the man for which we have a holiday, right? And that's how it really was for me in the early days in elementary school, and probably until middle school, that's when I started learning. So I would love to know your story of how did you learn about Dr. King, and then maybe jump a little bit ahead to then also hear about what influence, what role has he played in your personal and professional life?
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? I was an adolescent when Dr. King was challenging society to integrate and bringing about his civil rights efforts. And as an adolescent, watching him on television, watching the ways in which water was used with the demonstrators, with the dogs, and so on and so forth, it really fueled my sense of rage and anger as a teenager. I knew that something special was happening in the world, and I wanted to be a part of it. And I was involved in my adolescent rebellion, and so creative maladjustment that Dr. King talks about, creative disobedience was right up my alley. And I grew up in Arizona, where there was conservatism and ill treatment of all kinds of people of color. Never had the experience in the South in the way that my parents had. And so to see the courage that was displayed daily on the television was really quite a moving experience for me. As a psychologist, I try and incorporate some of Dr. King's positions in my work with people who have internalized the notion that they are less than. That one of Dr. King's statements was that if I can't do great things, I can do small things in great ways. And I attempt to encourage people who are the victims of trauma, the victims of internalized depression, the victims of their own self-hatred, to interrupt the oppression in order to support their empowerment to change their plight in the world. And so that's one of the ways in which I continue to embrace Dr. King's legacy in the work that I do. I'm also a visions consultant, and one of the things that I find incredibly important and difficult to do, and that is as we talk about holding the both and, in Dr. King's position on the beloved community, It was about loving our enemies, transformative love that brings about a different level of community. And we strive to do that as multicultural consultants. I strive to do that. And it is exceedingly difficult in the year 2016.
So, good morning. And the first thing I want to say is that I felt God in this church, that I was in that for the first time. I've been coming to Pasadena for about 15 years for peer supervision. And as I sat there, I started to tear up and cried quite a bit. And that I cry when I feel God, the presence of God in a space. And the last song, Let Your Little Light Shine, I started crying when I sang it because I realized how hard it is for me to let my light shine. And it's not because there's no light in me. It's because of the oppression that I feel every day, right? Like that walking in the skin that I walk, in the body that I walk, attracts all kinds of responses. And so that what courage it takes for people who are oppressed to let our light shine and not attract attacks from other people, not like the dictatorial, self-righteous Latina coming into a space, right? Like there's all kinds of ways in which every day I'm confronted with it. And so just to sing that song and to allow my light to shine is a huge effort, and it takes courage for me to do that. And yet, it's like what Spirit calls me to do. So I wanted to start with that reflection. The other thing that I've been deeply sitting with is how amazing an opportunity it is that I'm sitting here with my brother, Jim Turner, who I have been partnering in this work with for 17 years. And then with Ed, who I've been in circle and in conversation about race and power for about 12, 15 years. And then Juliana, who recently joined, right? So to be sitting here focused on the legacy of Dr. King, and to be focused on what it is that God, life, is calling us to do to create the world that we want to live in, right? Like that's why we're here. And I was sharing with Jim that I've been paying a lot of attention to numbers lately and dates, right? It's been 524 years since my land and my people have been colonized, right? Like I am a native person of this continent. My family has been here for 5,000 years. And so when we think about refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala, we're talking about First Nations people who just happens to live a few thousand miles away from this land, but who are native to this continent. And so don't they too deserve to benefit in the fruits of this land? And so I'd like to reframe and label things by their right name. We're not refugees. We're not immigrants. We're First Nations people that have managed to survive 524 years of colonization. On the same breath, I'm sitting here with my brother Jim, and I was saying to him that this year marks the 400th year since the first African was brought to this land as a slave. Yet our country's been around for 240 years, right? We have an incredible legacy of oppression to undo. And our lives are maybe 95, 105 years? Hopefully, that's how long my grandmother lived. And my great-grandmother lived, and my grandmother's alive at 95. So every minute, I feel like I need to dedicate my life to building this world that we can all live in, right? And so for me, the key legacies that Dr. King has left me, or the things that drive me every day, is this message of love, right? I have a lot to be angry about. I have a lot to be hateful of. Everything from thinking about the 524 years that my land has been colonized and taken, where I have lost rights, where everything from precious metals to my labor has been extracted. Right? There's a lot that I could be extremely angry and feel a lot of hate for. Yet I know that that's not going to get me anywhere, right? Because what we need to build is a place where we all can fit and we all can share in God's love. And so for me, the message of building a beloved community and coming from a place of love and coming from a place of building And coming from that place of like seeing in the person who can potentially say the most painful thing to me, right? Like, which happens, like things like, God, you're so eloquent, right? Or, you know, you're so smart, your English is so, you know, so you're so well-spoken, right? Little comments that I know are meant, come from a place of goodness, yet because of the legacy of racism and xenophobia, land as a slap in the face. Even in those moments, I can take a deep breath and remember that in that person, the lack of knowing doesn't come from hate, it comes from ignorance. It comes from not understanding and not feeling from a place of heart our connection. And so I root myself every day in everything that I do in that. It's hard, as Dr. Turner said, as Jim said. Yeah. It's extremely difficult, you know, and I'm not always perfect, but that's what I aim for.
Dr. King was an agitator, as Ed preached about today, and he certainly brought to light the injustices that people in our nation have experienced. And he spoke in terms of these injustices beyond even race, right? And he talked a lot about, and that was part of my own learning too, as I emerged into my adulthood, of learning how much he talked about class and he talked about hunger. And so I'm wondering, in the period that we had Dr. King, and he was certainly a powerful man that, you know, to this day we honor and respect him and celebrate his good work. There were significant challenges, and we still have challenges that you speak of. I would love to hear from you, especially in the context of the work that you do every single day. What do you see as the challenges that we face in our nation and in our world today when it comes to the race and economics and religion and so forth? How do we see those playing out today, and how do they differ from the way they existed or manifested themselves in the time of Dr. King?
It's a huge question and an important one. You know, I keep hearing people say that we're in the post-Obama era, and that there's a way in which racism no longer bites in the same way that it did years ago. We know that the realities are just as harsh for poor people today as they've always been. We know that hatred and the ability to speak it publicly is rising everywhere. We know that our schools are underfunded, and the promise of education as a way to bring us to social justice is under attack. All of those things that Dr. King fought for and had some success early on in making a difference have found, that we're finding today, are moving backwards. I'm really aware of how there's so much trauma in the world today that's affecting all of us, and that we really need to have compassionate witness to continue to have the energy to go forward. And that what we're finding is just the opposite in our dialogues and the way in which we're not engaging in the kinds of conversations and in the kinds of messaging that Dr. King was putting forth in his time. And so I long for opportunities to do that, to have the creative conversations and to be engaged to make a difference.
You know, I have to say that these are some of the hardest times, right? Like, I don't know if it's that I'm like deeply conscious now, so I can see and feel things more intensely than ever before. Yet, it really strikes me that what most people in this country, or what the tide in this country loves, is power, money, right? That this culture is driven by the love of power and money, which is completely contrary to the love of each other and the love of God, right? Like, that if we really truly loved each other and loved God, society would not look the way it does, right? We know that we're facing the greatest wealth gap ever in the history of this country, right? We know that poor people are living with less and that wages have not been raised since the 1970s. We know that right now gentrification is pushing out thousands of families from inner city neighborhoods. We know that these families have nowhere to go. I don't know how a person can live, with $10 or $12 an hour, and raise a family. So we're living in one of the greatest times of immorality and lack of love and care, right? And then we blame people for it, right? Like that we blame people for being poor. We blame people for not being able to go to their child's, parent-teacher conference when the parent may be working 2-3 jobs to be able to keep food on the table. We're also living at a greatest time where militarism, technology, have deeply been deeply rooted in policing. So we know that more people are being killed, more black men and women, and people of color are being killed at the hands of police. And so we're living at a time of real crisis where speaking and not being silent is necessary. I sit with that heaviness, right? And so for me, I really have to ground myself in understanding that my job, and I hope all of your jobs, is to be a warrior for equity, right? And to be a warrior that is fighting the fight for love, right? For love and what that means and how that then translates into the ways that we build communities and we build cities and the way that we share resources. So that's what I think some of the greatest challenges at a macro level. At an individual level, I think that technology and separation is really getting in the way of us connecting to each other as human beings. So we're no longer seeing each other's humanities and no longer trying to understand each other's stories. And so the more that television, what gets produced on TV, the fact that not one person of color was nominated for the Oscars this year after so much attention was put to last year, then we need to look at institutionally who gets to vote, right? And so you see that it's primarily white men who continue to vote. And so, the cards are stacked against us, and yet it is in moments like this, right, where I can see you and you can see me and you can understand my story and I want to hear your story, is where we can start to nurture love and be able to create the kinds of communities that we all want to live in.
I would just add that in terms of technology, what I see as the challenge as well is that there's the myth that you're building relationship, right? There's the belief that you're establishing community and people are engaging, and then it's completely false. It's completely fabricated. And only when you're truly proximate, as we know Brian Stevenson talks about, when you become relational with a person and you hear their story and they hear yours, is something created. But these Facebook and all these other things, it's all fabricated and under the myth of creating community. I want, Ana, for you to address something specifically that you brought up earlier, this whole notion of microaggressions. And I know as a Latina, I have been the recipient of microaggressions in my life as well. That same thing, like the surprise, like, oh, you're smart. Why does that come as a surprise, right? Yeah. Why does that come as a surprise? So I'm wondering if you can teach us a little bit more about what that means, because I think that there are some people in the room who aren't familiar with that terminology, and I would love it if you could teach us a little bit about what microaggressions are.
Yes, thank you. So I like to think of them as the 1,000 little paper cuts that I get every day, right? Like that, a paper cut, it's so minor, right? And the feeling and the pain goes away after 5 seconds. But in those 5 seconds, the pain is so acute and so intense. So a microaggression are all the little ways in which white supremacy or heterosupremacy, or sexism demonstrates itself, right? So it's the little, like not looking into my eyes, but kind of looking at other people around me, not making eye contact with people of color, people who are queer, saying little comments that are meant to be building a relationship, but really express an othering, right? Like that, it's like so often I get asked, well, where are you from? I'm like, this land. I am from this land. Where are you from? Right? Like I have not traveled that far. It's Um, so so it's unconscious comments, right? That monoculturalism and white supremacy, it's so embedded in everything, in the air that we breathe, in everything that we think about. Even to myself, like I've had to go through a process of rediscovering and claiming who I am, right? Because cultural genocide labeled me Latina, right? And so then that's supposed to be what? What is that, right? That's a cultural ethnic term, but it's not a racial category. And so when I start to look at both who I am as a human and know that I'm native to this land, I'm a native person that has, traditions that date back so long. And so microaggressions are both the subtle comments that other me, that cause deep pain in me, and that usually come from people who are not conscious of what they're saying. And so the more that I gain consciousness about other people, because I can do it too, right? I can do it to Jim because I'm not black. I could say something that's a microaggression against Jim that's not welcomed, right? And that causes him pain. And what that does is that it creates separation between me and the other person.
So you could be well-intentioned, but still have a negative, or I should say, and still have a negative impact on someone by something you say or do.
Yeah. I wanted to just share one that when I came out as a lesbian, there were men who said to me, "God, but you're so attractive." It was like, right? Like it's, yeah. And so, and then some are obviously like straight up, homophobic or racist comments, right? So microaggressions are the subtle comments.
So the reality is we may be living in a society where our drinking fountains aren't segregated anymore, but just because that isn't true doesn't mean that racism still doesn't, it just has a different form, it's shape-shifted. It looks different now. Jim, did you want to say something earlier?
I wanted to say that another form of microaggression is micro-invalidation, and that was part of what you were speaking to as well. The ways in which we only hear people that we believe have credibility, and that we're not listening to all the voices that are speaking truth to power. And so it's really important to hear that as well. I also believe that so much of what is in the way of building sustainable alliances across differences is that we are not aware of what we don't know, and we're not willing to engage in being educated about what's outside of our awareness in order to do better.
I appreciate you mentioning that. So I want to hear from you now with the final time that we have left, and I'm realizing that this is going by so quickly and I can talk to you forever about this. How do we begin to dismantle this? How do we begin to dismantle and eradicate racism? And I'm curious to hear from you too, as an African-American man and as a Native woman of this land, how do we utilize groups to do the work, intragroups and intergroups, to accomplish this task of dismantling racism?
You want to go?
It's a big question.
Yes.
I'm happy to.
Go for it.
Okay. I always follow my elders, right? That's one of my native traditions. And so I wanted to.
And I'm living into being an elder.
Well, we do this all the time with all kinds of groups, right? Like we've been working with a group of 500 to a group of 20, and and I think first and foremost is showing up fully authentically, showing up as we are, and being able to model with each other what it means to have true, real cross-racial partnerships, right? And that sometimes looks like cross-racial, cross-gender, cross-sexual preference, cross so many things, right? And so sometimes that looks like in the room, like something will happen and we'll talk it out. And we'll show people that when I confront Jim's sexism, Jim's not gonna die, right? And when he confronts my anti-blackness, I'm not gonna die, right? I'm just gonna learn. And so even by doing that simple act of being able to be real with each other and being able to be respectful and leaning into the love and trust, right? Yeah, this is a relationship that's taken 20 years to build. And yet that in every moment we can start to build authentic relationships where I can accept that I'm gonna screw up, right? That I am not perfect. And one of the insidious things about whiteness is this insistence of being right and knowing. And the knowing mind and the being afraid of making a mistake. Well, step one is to let that go. Be messy. Not be like, don't account for your messiness. Don't aim to understand from a heart place, not just a mind place. But accept that you're going to screw up. And be ready for the screw up. When you screw up, how will you take accountability for how I screwed up? Right? I'm being able to say it. I made a mistake. I want to learn. Will you share with me if you're willing? Right? And so I think that that's one of the things. And we take a lot of time designing the ways and the process, and we understand the people that we're working with as much as we can. And then we aim to be able to deliver what people are ready to be able to embrace and take on. Right? So we never push too much. Like my mom says, a pot boils when it's ready, right? So you can't overdo it. You have to pace it so that people can step in courageously to where they're ready to step in.
And I would say that all of what you said, and that we've lived long enough to know that we're never going to end depression, but we can interrupt it. And interrupting oppression in group settings is one of the most effective ways to do it. We do it individually, interrupting it in ourselves and in the individual clients or the people that we coach in order to show up with an ability to reach across the aisles. We also, in our group work, provide frameworks and tools for people to understand how to engage differently. How do we try on new ways of being as we are uncomfortable? And how do we challenge the notion that discomfort equates with safety, and that therefore we have the right not to show up? That silence is one of the hallmarks of oppression. And the more that we can engage in undoing silence that reinforces and perpetuates oppression, the more we will move toward the kind of society that we want. And group work is one of the best ways to make that happen.
So before we wrap this up, I want to come back to something that the two of you mentioned at the very beginning. Jim, in particular, with your professional work as a psychologist and working with people who've been traumatized by our world telling them that they don't have a light inside them. And then Anna, your comment about our final song in worship today, This Little Light of Mine. From your perspectives, what can we do to get everyone in the room to realize, to recognize that we have a light inside us, and we have the same light that Dr. King had. And so Dr. King, while a special and powerful man that, again, we look up to, we have to embrace everything that he was and carry on that legacy of work and continue to fight these injustices and the inequity that exists in our life. How can we do that? How can we rekindle that light?
I think we have to start with ourselves first. I'm reminded of Howard Thurman, who was one of Dr. King's mentors, and he taught about the sound of the genuine in each one of us. And I wake up listening for the genuine in me, so that when I encounter the opposite, I want to go back and breathe into the rightness of my being, so that the rightness of another can come forth. And I think it's in that mutuality that there is the potential for redemption and reconciliation.
I want to bring forward, the idea of that self-care and self-love for oppressed people, and for all of us, it's an act of preservation, right? Like as warriors fighting the good fight for love and for equity, self-preservation as an act of love is a radical notion, right? That I can allow myself to care for myself, to be able to find that shine and to be able to then express it to you, to fight this fight for love and for the communities that we want to build. So that's my answer to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, again, I'm so grateful for your time, for coming out and being with us today. And I just want to acknowledge that I see in you that you're agitators and you're extremists for love and justice. And I'm so grateful that we got to know you a little bit better today. And everyone in the audience got to know you better. Yes, Ed.
So my final word is, again, to thank these two amazingly wise and transformative people for being with us. Before we applaud them, I would love to make some neural pathways in your brains between them and the words visions and 4-day process or pace, because you will be repeatedly invited to join these people and people like them who've been trained in these values to deepen your own skills in interrupting racism and every other form of supremacy that oppresses people. So please keep a head up for any time we talk about visions in the future, or a 4-day training, or a PACE training, or multiculturalism training, because this is the kind of nurture and equipment you'll get. So now I want to thank Juliana, Anna, and Jim for being with us on this Martin Luther King Day. Thank you very much.